Good day. I've noticed over the last couple of hours a shift in the way in which Russian officials are discussing the Battle of Bakhmut. They're now starting to speak about Bakhmut as being in an operational cauldron. In other words, a situation where the Ukrainian forces within Bakhmut are under effective encirclement and where the situation for Ukrainian troops is becoming increasingly critical. And this moves us further from the position just a few days ago when the Russians were careful to say that Bakhmut had not been fully encircled. There were still access routes to the town from available to Ukraine. Well, as I said, they're not talking like that so much anymore. And as an example, I'm going to quote Yan Gagin, who we've come across before. He is an advisor to Denis Pushilin, who is the acting head of the government of the Donetsk People's Republic. Obviously, Pushilin is a Russian official, and Gagin must be considered a Russian official also. So I'm taking this report this time not from TASS, but from Redovka. Redovka is a Russian newspaper published, I believe, in Smolensk, which is not a town west of Moscow. It's, again, well known for having a fairly patriotic position on most issues. Mostly, by the way, it covers domestic news, which it does, I find, in a very interesting and far from over-emotional way. But anyway, it does have, as I said, a trend to be a sort of more on the patriotic, nationalist side of things within Russia itself. At the same time, like many of these journals in Russia, I find that its actual reporting, and it seems to have large teams of reporters working across the front lines. Anyway, its actual reporting, in my experience, has tended to be fairly reliable. And of course, this is just a quotation of what Yan Gagin said in an interview. And the interview was not given with Redovka. It was given on Russian state television. So this is the Redovka report. I should say that this is a machine translation. Redovka publishes in Russian. I've slightly adapted it to make it a little clearer. And the report reads as follows. Currently, Bakhmut is in operational encirclement by the Russian army. About 10,000 Ukrainian troops remain in the city. This information having been given by Yan Gagin, an advisor to the head of the government of the Donetsk People's Republic. Gagin said on Russia TV, now a fairly large garrison remains in Artyomovsk, i.e. Bakhmut, about 10,000 people, perhaps a little more. Some parts have left, some parts are trying to leave. At the same time, our artillery is trying to get them. And Redovka then quotes Gagin as saying that the Russian armed forces control all entrances to Bakhmut so that the supply of ammunition and transport of troops for the armed forces of Ukraine has become problematic and dangerous. However, Gagin does not rule out the possibility that the Ukrainian military might try either to break into the city to deliver ammunition or possibly even to try to break out. And he says, he's quoted as saying the following, in the same way there will be attempts to break out from there, including through fighting, in order to escape to Chasov Yar. And Gagin then goes on to say in this Russia TV interview that a new cauldron has now formed in the area of the town, which can be compared to Debaltseve and others in which the Ukrainian armed forces were previously boiled. And he's then quoted by Redovka as also saying that Russian forces, he means, of course, the Wagner organization troops, are now also have now reached the central parts of Bakhmut and are pressing to capture the remaining part, which is the part west of the Bakhmutsky River. In other words, to capture all of Bakhmut, including those western areas which still remain under Ukrainian control. So this is one example, as I said, of Russian commentators and Russian officials talking about a cauldron having formed, and note, not just in Bakhmut itself, but in and around Bakhmut. And Gagin estimates the number of Ukrainian troops who are trapped inside this cauldron as over 10,000, which corresponds quite closely with the figure of 10 to 12,000, which I mentioned, another Russian official, another Russian commentator, as having spoken about yesterday. So we've gone from 7,000 to 3,000 to 10 to 12,000. I'm going to guess that the original figures of 3 to 7,000 referenced Ukrainian troops within Bakhmut itself. The other 10 to 12, the other thousands that we're talking about are the troops who are Ukrainian troops in the immediate vicinity of Bakhmut. You could even break it down if you like. You could say that there was 3,000 in Bakhmut, 7,000 nearby, all within this operational cauldron, and perhaps that figure of 7,000 I spoke about earlier was based on a misunderstanding. Maybe when it was initially reported, it referred to the troops just outside Bakhmut, to which perhaps the 3,000 within Bakhmut should be added. Now, can I obviously say that these are figures that are coming from Russian officials? I'm not on the spot. I cannot confirm them. There's no information about troop numbers that I've been able to find coming from Ukrainian sources, which tell us how many Ukrainian troops there are in and close to Bakhmut itself. So that gives us some idea of what the Russians at least are saying about the situation in Bakhmut. And note carefully what Gagin is talking about. He's not saying that every single access point to Bakhmut has been completely sealed, that in other words, that this is like a sort of siege, with a kind of medieval siege with a stockade. Right at the start of the war, when I was first talking about cauldrons, I discussed how they work. They are in effect a situation where a force has basically control of all the roads and obvious access points. Sometimes, well, soldiers, individual soldiers, can come and go from in and out of these cauldrons, though it's increasingly dangerous to do so, because all of the areas are covered by the artillery of the besieger, if you like, the Russians in this case. And in addition, I'm going to make a guess that there's now patrols, Russian patrols, also operating along some of these fields and country roads that we're talking about. It's likely that Russian reconnaissance units have penetrated into this area, even if it still remains nominally under Ukrainian control. And in fact, we are seeing pictures, I've seen pictures, again, their accuracy and how representative they are of the actual information, I can't confirm. But there are pictures of Ukrainian troops trying to leave or trying to move across fields and country lanes, often running or trying to run across these fields and country lanes. There's also pictures of large amounts of destroyed vehicles and machines littering the landscape, obviously targeted by the Russian artillery. So the Russian forces have now, in effect, therefore, gained fire control. They've essentially cut the access roads, the proper metal roads, into BAKHMUT. It's still possible, perhaps, for small groups of Ukrainian soldiers, scattered groups of Ukrainian soldiers, to come and go, but it's increasingly dangerous for them to do so. And an organized retreat is becoming very difficult. Now, Gagin here referred to a battle that took place during the earlier fighting in Ukraine. Fighting, by the way, which I've noticed Western commentators try to avoid talking about. But he's referring to a battle in a place called Debaltseve, which took place in 2015. Now, in 2015, after the first of the two Minsk agreements was signed, the Ukrainian army nonetheless decided to try to launch an offensive to try to capture a place called Debaltseve, which formed a kind of hinge point between the two breakaway republics, as they then still were, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. And a force of around 30,000 Ukrainian troops, by most accounts, was directed, advanced towards Debaltseve, and it did occupy Debaltseve, but it was quickly operationally encircled by the Donbass militia, doubtless assisted in various ways by the Russian armed forces. I'm not going to get into a discussion as to how that worked out. And in effect, those 30,000 men became trapped, and this created massive amounts of alarm in Western capitals, and as I very well remember, it precipitated a flight by Angela Merkel, at that time Germany's Chancellor, to Moscow, a private meeting in the Kremlin between herself and Vladimir Putin, a meeting in which no one else was present, not even interpreters. And it's been fairly clear to me that at this meeting, Merkel proposed what eventually became the Minsk agreement, and Putin went along with it. And the two, Putin and Merkel, then convened a meeting of the Russians, the leaders of the Donbass republics of that period, President Poroshenko of Ukraine, and of course Merkel and the French President François Hollande. They all came to Minsk, and that was where the Minsk agreement, to all appearances, was formally agreed. Though, as I've discussed many times subsequently, Ukraine refused to honor it. President Poroshenko, former President Poroshenko of Ukraine, has admitted that he had never had any intention of honoring it. And the Germans and the French, as both Merkel and Hollande have now admitted, eventually came to accept and realized that, and went along with the fiction that the Minsk agreement was still operative, even as Ukraine was violating its terms and was rearming. I'm not going to go into more details about all of that now. But anyway, that is the battle, Debaltseve, which Gagin is referencing. And the sequel to the Battle of Debaltseve is that the Ukrainian forces, largely because of the progress of the negotiations in Minsk, were able on that occasion to escape, though large numbers of them were killed. And it seems, according to Gagin, that the forces in Bakhmut, the Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut, now find themselves in a similar position, that there is no sign this time of any Angela Merkel riding to the rescue, rushing off, dashing off to Moscow, having secret talks, or perhaps not so secret talks, with Vladimir Putin. I'm sure that the Russians were recording every part of this conversation between Merkel and Putin. But again, I said, that's another story. There's going to be no, as I said, rescuing angel like Angela Merkel flying to Moscow to try to extract them from this cauldron which they are now in. Now, Gagin does float the possibility that the Ukrainians might try a breakout. I'll come to that in a moment. And he also floats the possibility that they might also try a break-in. And he speaks about the presence of Ukrainian forces in Chasiv Yar, and he suggests that that might be the plan. I'm going to suggest that over the next couple of days, the Russians will be working hard to thicken the effective encirclement of Bakhmut that they've achieved, to close the remaining gap to the extent that they need to and can. After all, this is all apparently now happening over broken country, and to put impassable barriers between the Ukrainian troops in Chasiv Yar and the Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut. Now, yesterday there was a report to the effect that Russian tactics in Bakhmut have now changed, that the Russians seem more interested now in capturing Bakhmut than in encircling the Ukrainian troops there. I'm going to say that there's been no change in Russian tactics. I think the Russian tactics are both to capture Bakhmut and to encircle and defeat as many Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut as they can. If they can destroy a Ukrainian force of 10,000 men, if they can force it to surrender en masse, if they break the resistance there, then of course it will compound for Ukraine the damage done by the fact of its defeat in Bakhmut. And I am confident that that is what the Russians will at least try to do. Now, whether they will succeed is another matter. We'll see what the Ukrainians do. The Ukrainians might decide that the moment has come to pull all their forces out of Bakhmut. We're going to talk about that in a moment. Or they might do what Jan Gagin is talking about. They might try to come to the rescue of the Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut by sending their soldiers at Chasiv Yar, these new units that have been rushed to Chasiv Yar, to try to break in, perhaps to continue the fight in Bakhmut, or perhaps to create a corridor through which these troops in Bakhmut can escape. Either is a possibility. So this battle is not finished. It's perhaps becoming more complicated, but we are now at a very important stage. Now let's talk about these two possibilities. Ukrainian troops retreating from Bakhmut. Well, first of all, there's been a lot of reports, including ones in the British media today, that the Ukrainians are trying to carry out some kind of orderly withdrawal from Bakhmut. And even the British media is admitting that that is a complex and difficult operation in a situation of this kind. Now, the whole point of a cauldron, however, is to make an orderly withdrawal not just difficult, but well nigh impossible. As I said, men can perhaps escape, but doing so is extremely risky and might come with high losses. And in fact, there was a report yesterday that 2 groups of Ukrainian soldiers were spotted by the Russians trying to leave Bakhmut, and they were shelled by Russian artillery, and the Russians claimed that 30 of them were killed and the rest scattered and had to flee back to Bakhmut. So that gives us some idea. If this, again, I have to always caveat this, assuming that this incident happened and it isn't Russian propaganda, which it might be, by the way. An operational encirclement can be achieved through psychological means as well as actual ones if Ukrainian soldiers in Bakhmut come to believe that trying to flee from the town is a death sentence, then they might be deterred from doing so. So just bear those possibilities in mind. But assuming that this Russian report is true, which on balance I think it probably is, then we can see the difficulties. Even the British media is admitting that there are difficulties. The difficulties might be greater even than the British media realises, especially given, as I said, that any retreat would have to be across country or along these difficult country lanes. So that's one problem. Now, what about an advance, a breakthrough attempt from Chasiv Yar? Now, a couple of days ago, there were rumours that Ukraine has rushed some of its new Leopard 2 tanks just supplied from Poland to Chasiv Yar. And perhaps that report is true. I've seen no confirmation. And perhaps the reason those tanks are there is because they are intended to lead some sort of breakthrough operation to try to rescue the Ukrainian soldiers in Chasiv Yar. However, doing that, it seems to me, would be a very high-risk operation indeed. It would mean potentially sacrificing some of these Leopard 2 tanks, which Ukraine has only just received and cannot have fully learnt how to operate, on what might very well turn out to be a fruitless attempt to try to break in to Bakhmut. It might, in fact, even play into a breakthrough attempt like this, might even play into the Russian operational plan all along, which is to use Bakhmut to bleed Ukraine dry. And we've heard the first proper admission, well, I say proper admission, we've heard one of the early admissions maybe, that is the function that Bakhmut has served, and it comes from the Wall Street Journal. And there's been an article, and it says that Russia's Wagner troops exhaust Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut, and deadly fight against the penal battalions threatens Kiev's ability to mount spring offensive. And we're going to come to that in a moment, because again, what the Wall Street Journal is saying, and by the way, this is an article which has been copied to me, by the way, by a friend. I'm not going to read it though, because it's, as I said, it's behind a paywall. But anyway, the article again takes skewed very much to the Ukrainian version of the war, as you would expect. It speaks of the Russian army being stalled, talks about the Russians having been prepared to sacrifice large numbers of men in the Wagner organization in BAKHMUT. It appears to assume that most of the men who are fighting in the Wagner organization are ex-convicts, which, by the way, is certainly definitely not the case. Certainly, Wagner has recruited from Russian prisons, absolutely open about doing that, young men from Russian prisons, but a very significant proportion, perhaps the bulk of the Wagner troops, are clearly ex-Russian military. And I think that's how we need to understand them. But anyway, the point is, the key point to take away from this Wall Street Journal article is that Ukraine has suffered exorbitantly high losses trying to hold on to BAKHMUT, and the article admits that some of Ukraine's best units have in effect been sacrificed in the defense of BAKHMUT. It's not, in other words, just territorial defense troops, reservists, young boys, old men. It's not people like that. There's been some of Ukraine's best, most experienced units have been committed to trying to defend BAKHMUT, and they suffered massive losses, and they've been severely weakened or even destroyed in the attempt. So that's obviously going to be compounded if troops now relocated to Chasov Yar are sent in to attack the Russian forces building up and strengthening the encirclement of BAKHMUT. Even if the Ukrainians achieve a breakthrough, it will probably be brief. The losses incurred in doing it will be extremely high. If Leopard 2 tanks are indeed used in this attack, some of them, almost perhaps even most of them, will be lost, and Ukraine's armed forces will be further weakened. It doesn't seem to me like a good or wise trade, and that's putting it mildly. But Gagin concedes the possibility that that's what might happen, and given Ukrainian conduct in this battle up to this point, it's a real possibility. Now, I'm going to come back to the question of the spring offensive and what effect the fighting in BAKHMUT has had on that shortly. Now, in the meantime, what is actually going on? As I said, we've heard that we were talking yesterday about how the Russians have almost reached the roads. I should say that yesterday, after I made my video, I saw more reports that the Russians have made further advances in the area of Homovo, almost cutting now, almost literally. They seem to be almost on the road, the last remaining road that Ukraine is using, the one where the Ukrainians blew up the bridge. And it turns out that that report that the Ukrainians did blow up that bridge on this road is absolutely correct. They're using some kind of temporary bridge structure in its place. It all looks to me very much like an action that was taken at least as much to try to limit the possibility of a withdrawal and disorganized retreat from BAKHMUT as it was in order to try to slow down any Russian advances. Anyway, that's the situation there. And coming back to what Gagin was saying, it's clear that the Russians are now also pushing forward hard within BAKHMUT itself. The last report was that they control 40% of the town. It's likely that before long, perhaps even now, they control more of it than that. Obviously, the Bakhmutsky River is an obstacle, but the Russians are attacking from various directions, not just from the east, but also from the north and the south, and gradually Ukrainian forces within Bakhmut are being pushed. And they're being pushed and they're being squeezed. Now, it's a misconception, by the way, one that I've seen in various articles, including some more recent ones, that the fighting in Bakhmut is exhausting Russian troops, that in street fighting, the defender has an automatic advantage. I saw a report that supposedly the fighting in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk exhausted the Russian army in the summer because, as I said, it involved street fighting, and this opened the way for the Ukrainian offensive in Kharkiv and Kherson. Now, it's interesting that people focused on the street fighting in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk and ignored the much more intense and much more prolonged street fighting that took place earlier in Mariupol, which, of course, doesn't seem to have impacted on the fighting in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. But anyway, and suffice to say, it is a misconception, it appears to be a misconception, that street fighting necessarily results in higher casualties for the attacker than the defender. It depends on many things. It depends on supplies. It depends on training of troops. It depends on artillery and ammunition support. And in all of those, the Russians are well supplied or adequately supplied. I'll come to that in a moment. Whereas, if they are in an operational cauldron, the Ukrainians are not. So anyway, we are, it seems, according to Gagin at least, in a cauldron-type situation now in Bakhmut. We'll see whether that continues. We'll see what course the fighting takes there. If there is a cauldron, and there really are 10,000 Ukrainian troops, or more than that, encircled, then in my experience, cauldrons can take quite a long time to resolve themselves. Fighting in Ukraine in 2014 and 2015 provided examples of this. Cauldrons could sometimes take weeks to resolve, and of course the same turned out to be true in Mariupol. So it may be that if the Russians are indeed intent on creating a cauldron, that will be quite a long and intense battle that we have ahead. I should say, and I would just quickly complete my points about Bakhmut when I say that once the Russians do control Bakhmut, they have effectively broken the Zelensky line, and they've put themselves in a position where they're able to block the communications links between the various Ukrainian forces in Donbass. It becomes much more difficult from that point on for the Ukrainians to move their forces around Donbass. And of course, if the Russians also capture the hills to the west of Bakhmut, something which I suspect would include capturing Chasov Yar, well then of course they will be in a position to start shelling Kramatorsk and probably Slavyansk as well. But again, it will take some time, some weeks at least, for the Russians to consolidate these gains, to establish themselves in all these places, to round up all the Ukrainian stragglers who might still be around and might still be able to offer resistance, to put themselves in a position where they can hold on to all of these new positions that they've captured against potential Ukrainian counterattacks. So one shouldn't assume that the moment Bakhmut falls, the Russians will rush forward into the next advance. The whole Russian approach has been incremental. They will capture Bakhmut, they will consolidate, they will reorganize, they will rest, they will build up their ammunition and artillery stocks, and they will move on. Now, that brings me to this subject of ammunition and artillery. Again, reports circulating a few days ago, very much based on claims and complaints from Yevgeny Prigozhin that the Russians are suffering from ammunition shortages. But then reports circulated again yesterday that all of these problems on the Russian side have been resolved. I think that the answer is straightforward. The Russians provide ammunition. They're able to ship ammunition to their troops. The troops then fire them. Sometimes they fire more ammunition than is available, that has been supplied. It takes a day or so for the ammunition trains and trucks to arrive, and that obviously staggers the tempo a little. I think that's all that there is to it, and I think people are very unwise, if I may say so, to place too much dependence on what Prigozhin is saying. Prigozhin, let me reiterate again, clearly has a feud, an ongoing feud with some senior officials in the Russian Defense Ministry, particularly, I suspect, Surovikin and Gerasimov. And at the same time, he is not the military commander of the Wagner organization. He has no background in the military. He's never served in the Russian military. He has no training as a soldier. He's no training as an officer or a senior officer. He is there. Obviously, he likes to be seen in a flak jacket and a helmet. He gives all kinds of vivid videos. He makes all kinds of vivid statements. Obviously and undoubtedly, he's keen to make sure that his troops, the troops in the Wagner organization, of which he claims a kind of ownership, are fully supplied with all the equipment that they need. And as I said, he has also his personal feud with some of the senior military people in Moscow, something which I think is going to work out badly for him in the long term. But he's not the commander. He's not the person who's actual charge of the troops. We don't fully know who that is, by the way. But putting all that aside, let's not base too much of our commentaries on what this very interesting and colourful and vivid observer of events tells us. It's not without use. He does confirm when a particular place is captured, and that's always useful. He does give us an insight into the progress of the battle, but he is not a fully reliable reporter of all that's happening, if only because he is an extremely self-interested one. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about that. Now,